Joren Talvik stood in the exit corridor of floor 12 and tried to remember the color of his sister's eyes. He knew the shape of her face. He knew the sound she made when she laughed at something she wasn't supposed to laugh at. He knew, with total certainty, that she used to steal the last piece of bread off his plate and call it a toll for being the older sibling. But when he reached for the color of her eyes, there was nothing there. Just a smooth, blank patch where a memory should have been, like a page torn cleanly out of a book he'd read 1,000 times. He'd noticed it an hour ago, mid-fight, in the second before a monster the size of a delivery cart tried to take his head off. It should have terrified him more than it did. Instead, he'd filed it away, the way he filed away everything that happened inside the spire, and kept moving. Behind him, the floor he'd just walked out of was still cooling. Ash drifted down from a ceiling that didn't exist anymore. Somewhere under the wreckage, a monster that 3 sponsored teams had failed to clear last season was lying very still, and Joren Talvik, bracket 2, 22 yield points to his name at the start of the day, had killed it alone, under max seal. That detail mattered more than the kill. Anyone could get lucky against a monster. Nobody got lucky against max seal. He let himself replay the last 10 minutes of it once, the way he always did, cataloging what had almost gone wrong so he wouldn't repeat it. Floor 12 had opened onto a flooded quarry, black water up to his knees, visibility reduced to whatever the phosphorescent moss growing along the walls decided to give him. The monster had come up out of the water without a ripple to announce it, a thing built like a crocodile crossed with something that had never needed a name, because nothing that looked at it lived long enough to give it one. The first exchange had gone badly. It had gotten a claw across his forearm before he'd even registered it as a threat, a wound that was already scabbing over under the wrap he hadn't had time to change yet. He remembered the water turning red around his knees and thinking, with the strange calm that only ever showed up mid-fight, that this was probably how it ended, and that thought hadn't frightened him nearly as much as it should have. He'd fought it for 6 minutes using nothing but instinct, and the 2 skills the tower had granted him off earlier clears, both of them worn thin from overuse, both of them not enough. It was the 7th minute that mattered. The 7th minute was when the pressure had come behind his eyes for the first time that day, brief and businesslike, no name attached, just 3 words dropped into his skull like stones into still water, under the jaw. He hadn't questioned it. He never questioned it anymore. Not in the moment, not with a claw already coming around for a second pass. He'd driven his blade up under the jaw exactly where the pressure told him to, into a gap in the plating he hadn't even known was there, and the monster had gone rigid and then still, folding into the black water like something deflating. That was the whole transaction. A word he couldn't buy from anyone else, paid for with something he wouldn't understand the price of until hours later, standing in a corridor, trying and failing to remember the color of his sister's eyes. He rolled his shoulder, felt something grind that shouldn't grind, and started walking toward the boards. The corridor that connected floor exits to the public concourse always smelled like ozone and old blood, no matter how many times the vault authority scrubbed it. Climbers called it the throat, because it was narrow, and because everyone who came through it looked like they'd just been swallowed and spat back out. Joren had walked the throat 41 times in the last year. He still hadn't gotten used to the way his legs shook once the adrenaline let go. A console blinked awake as he approached, reading the tag stitched into his sleeve. Floor 12, cleared. Seal tier, maximum. Climber, Talvik, J. Bracket 2. Then it did the thing the consoles always did when the numbers didn't make sense. It froze for a full 2 seconds, recalculating, as if it thought it had made an error. It hadn't. The number that finally posted made the console's little status light flicker orange, the color reserved for entries that needed manual verification before the public board would take them. 10 times. That was the whole secret, reduced to a single ratio nobody else was willing to touch. A climber who cleared a floor at standard seal walked away with 1 unit of yield for their trouble. Stat points, skill fragments, a modest cut of currency, whatever the floor happened to be seated with. A climber foolish or desperate enough to clear the same floor at maximum seal walked away with 10. Every guild in the city knew the math. Almost none of them used it, because the floors didn't get proportionally harder under a higher seal. They got exponentially harder. A floor that was a brisk afternoon at standard became something closer to a funeral at max. And everyone who'd ever tried to split the difference had learned that the tower didn't grade on effort. Joren had learned to survive it anyway. Nobody knew how. He preferred to keep it that way. He pressed his palm to the console to confirm his identity and watched his profile update in real time. Bracket 2 still, technically, since brackets moved slower than yield did, but the number beneath his name climbing in a way that made the machine hesitate again before it accepted the entry. Behind that hesitation was an entire year of climbers pretending not to notice him, and it was about to end. The throat spat him out into the concourse, and the concourse noticed. It always did, eventually. The Vault Authority ran the public ranking boards on massive vertical displays bolted to the concourse's outer wall. 3 stories of scrolling names and numbers that every climber in the city checked more compulsively than they checked their own bank balance. Joren's name was already climbing the board when he stepped out from under the throat's arch, blinking against daylight that always felt too bright after hours spent underground. A cluster of climbers near the boards turned to look at the number, then at him, then back at the number, as if the two things refused to connect in their heads. "That's not right," someone said. "Not quietly enough." "Check the seal tag," someone else said. "Has to be a mistake. Nobody clears 12 at max solo. He did it last month too. Floor 9. That's different. 9 isn't rated for. It's the same ratio. It's always the same ratio." Not everyone in the cluster looked uneasy about it. A younger climber near the back, still wearing the unscuffed gear of someone who hadn't cleared more than a handful of floors, was staring at the board with an expression closer to hunger than disbelief, already murmuring something to the friend beside her about which floor she'd try it on first, if her guild would sign off. Her friend didn't look nearly as convinced, glancing toward the older climbers' faces instead of the number, reading the fear there instead of the math. A man in a sponsor's polished vest near the kiosks was on his comm within seconds. Voice pitched low but not low enough, already asking someone on the other end whether their contracted climbers had clauses that let the guild block a seal choice outright. Joren caught the tail end of it as he passed. Something about optics and retention, and the words "everyone's going to want to try it" now delivered with more dread than excitement. A Vault Authority clerk stationed at a review kiosk near the board's base was watching the same number with a very different expression, less disbelief than something closer to alarm. She tapped at her terminal twice, frowning, then tapped a third time as if hoping the entry would resolve itself into something more ordinary. It didn't. Whatever she flagged it fast, murmuring into a comm bead clipped to her collar with her back half turned so nobody nearby could read her lips. Joren caught only 2 words of it before he was out of range. "Escalate, Ainsworth." He filed that away too, the way he filed everything, and kept his head down and walked past them toward the water station, because stopping to explain himself never went anywhere good, and because his hands had started to shake in the specific way that meant if he didn't sit down soon, he was going to do it on the concourse floor in front of everyone. He made it to a bench. That counted as a win. The whispering followed him anyway, the way it always did, climbers doing the math out loud without meaning to be overheard. Bracket 2 shouldn't be able to survive a Bracket 4 floor at standard, let alone max. There were rules about that. There were supposed to be rules about that. Technically, he wasn't breaking any of them. The eligibility line let a climber attempt max seal on anything up to 2 brackets above their own, and floor 12 sat exactly on that line. But nobody expected the rule to actually be used. It existed the way a warning label existed. It wasn't meant to be tested. He'd tested it 11 times now. He was still here. That was the part nobody could explain, and the part that made people uneasy, in a way his growing yield total alone never would have. Climbers who took foolish risks either got smart or got dead within a season. Joren had done neither. He just kept climbing, faster every time, like the tower was handing him something the rest of them weren't allowed to have. He let himself have 30 seconds of stillness before a voice cut through it, sharp and familiar and entirely unwelcome. "You're going to get someone killed being famous like this." Meera Calder dropped onto the bench beside him without being invited, the way she always did, close enough that her shoulder knocked his. She had climbing dust in her hair and a fresh cut along one forearm that she hadn't bothered to dress yet, which meant she'd come straight from her own floor the moment the alert about his clear had hit her feed. "Good to see you too," Joren said. "I mean it." She wasn't smiling. Meera rarely smiled when she was actually worried, which was a fact Joren had learned the hard way over 2 years of climbing beside her. You know what happens when other teams see that number and decide they want it too? They don't have whatever you have. They just have the debt from the gear and the guild fees. You're setting an example that gets people killed who aren't you. I'm not asking anyone to follow me. You don't have to ask. That's what fame does. She nodded at the board, where his name had climbed 2 more spots while they were talking. Look at that. You didn't even have to open your mouth. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't try to give her one. Meera had been climbing since she was 16, 3 years longer than him, and she'd built her whole strategy around the opposite of what he did. Steady standard seal clears, careful yield accumulation, a slow grind toward a bracket high enough to actually matter. It was the sane approach. It was also, by his private count, going to take her another 6 years to get where he intended to be inside 2. He didn't have 6 years. He wasn't sure he'd told anyone that out loud, not even her. "How was your own floor?" he asked, mostly to steer the conversation somewhere that wasn't him. "Standard seal, bracket 3. Exactly as boring as it sounds." She held up the arm with the fresh cut like evidence. "Cleared it in under 20 minutes. Yield posted about what you'd expect for a floor that boring. Enough to cover this month's guild dues, and maybe a third of what I actually need, which is the part nobody puts on the boards." She said it lightly, but there was an edge under it, the specific weariness of someone doing arithmetic in her head more often than she wanted to admit to. Some of us don't have a voice in our skulls handing out shortcuts. That's not what it is. I know what you tell yourself it is. She softened the words with half a smile, the closest she usually came to one. "I'm not trying to start anything. I just watch that board add zeros to your name in an afternoon, and think about how many boring, careful floors it would take me to get there instead. And some days, the math makes me tired in a way climbing never used to. You could ask me for help? I could." She said it simply, without heat, which somehow landed harder than if she'd snapped at him. "I won't. Not yet. Ask me again after you've survived a few more of these, and I still trust the math behind however you're doing it." She stood, brushing dust off her knees before he could push further, closing the subject the way she always closed subjects she wasn't ready to fully open. "You look like something happened in there," Meera said, quieter now, studying his face instead of the board. "More than the fight," he almost told her. The words sat right at the back of his throat. Elara's name, the missing color of her eyes, the blank patch where a memory used to be. He swallowed it instead. "Just tired," he said. Meera didn't believe him. He could see that much in the way her jaw tightened. But she let it go, because that was also part of how they worked. 2 years of knowing exactly when to push and when to wait for someone to be ready to talk on their own. "Talon's looking for you," she said instead, standing, brushing dust off her knees. "Saw him near the sponsor kiosks 20 minutes ago, already working himself into a mood about your number. You might want to be somewhere else." "I never want to be somewhere else more than when you tell me that. That's because you have terrible instincts about which fights to walk into." She was already walking away, throwing the last words over her shoulder. "Get that shoulder looked at. You're favoring it." He hadn't realized he was. He rolled it anyway, felt the grind again, and decided the water station chair had officially served its purpose. Talon Vesk found him before he found Talon, which was somehow always how it went. 12, Talon said, materializing at the end of the concourse with 2 members of his own sponsored team, trailing a step behind. The kind of practice distance that said they knew this conversation wasn't for them. "At max. Solo? You heard right. I heard the number. I don't believe the number." Talon was bracket 6, the highest active rank in the city outside a handful of names most people only saw on award ceremonies, and he wore that rank the way some men wore a title they'd inherited rather than earned, comfortably, and with the expectation that everyone else adjust their posture accordingly. "Do you know how many sponsored climbers I've had come to me this month asking why they can't clear at max, if some bracket 2, nobody can do it 11 times running? Tell them the eligibility line exists for a reason, and most people should respect it. I do tell them that. It doesn't matter, because you keep proving the reason wrong. Talon stepped closer, dropping his voice just enough that it wouldn't carry to the small audience that had started orbiting them without quite looking like they were listening. You understand what you're doing to the ranking system, don't you? Every clear you post makes Standard Seal look like a coward's choice. Sponsors start asking their climbers why they're not doing what you're doing, and then a bracket 3 team tries max on a floor they have no business touching, because some part of them believes if you can survive it, they can too. That's not my fault. It's exactly your fault. You're not just gambling with your own life. You're rewriting what everyone else thinks is possible, and most of them don't have whatever it is that's keeping you breathing. Talon's eyes narrowed, and for one unguarded second something underneath the hostility flickered through. Not concern, not quite, but something close enough to it that Joren almost didn't recognize it on him. So what is it? What are you not telling anyone? Nothing you'd believe. Try me. Joren held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, weighing exactly how much of the truth a man like Talon Vesk could carry without turning it into a weapon, and decided the answer was none of it. I got lucky, he said, 11 times. Say that to my face after you've said it to the 3 sponsors who pulled their funding from mid-tier teams this season because the boards made Standard Seal look like it was for cowards. Talon's team members shifted behind him, uncomfortable, and Joren understood then that this wasn't posturing for an audience. This was a man watching something he'd spent 6 years building start to wobble under him, and not yet knowing who to blame for it. You want to know why I care so much about a bracket 2 nobody? Because I climbed the honest way. Every floor, every seal choice weighed against what I could actually survive. 6 years of it, and I'm good at what I do. I'm the best in this city at what I do. And you've made that mean less in 11 clears than I made it mean in 6 years. And you won't even tell me how. It's not a trick, Talon. Then it's worse. It means there's something about you specifically that the towers decided to reward, and none of the rest of us get a vote in that. Talon's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Nobody gets lucky 11 times. Keep telling yourself that, and one day the number's going to be 12, and it's going to be the last one anybody ever posts for you. He turned to go, then paused, delivering the last line without turning back around. The vault authority's watching your board entries now. Officially. I'd get used to people asking harder questions than mine. He left before Joren could decide whether that last part had been a threat or a warning. With Talon, it was usually both, delivered in the same breath, so a man could claim either one later depending on how things turned out. Joren watched him go, then let himself breathe out slowly. The kind of exhale that took some of the tension out of his shoulders, even as the words settled into his stomach like a stone. The vault authority watching wasn't new information exactly. It was confirmation of something he'd assumed for weeks. Confirmation still had a way of landing heavier than assumption. He didn't go home that night. He went to the one place in the city where nobody expected him to explain himself. A narrow stretch of maintenance scaffolding 2 levels below the concourse that climbers weren't technically supposed to use for anything but equipment storage. And he sat with his back against a support strut and let the quiet close in around him. This was the part he'd never told Meera or Talon or anyone else who thought they understood what made him different. The voice didn't come every time. It came only when he'd earned it. Only inside the tower. Only under max seal. And only, he was starting to suspect, when it decided he'd bought the right to hear it. Tonight it came anyway, out here, in the scaffolding dark, which had never happened before, and that alone told him something about tonight was different from every other night. It didn't sound like a voice so much as a pressure behind his eyes that resolved, slowly, into words. Old words. Words spoken like someone picking each one up carefully before setting it down, as if speaking cost something. You bled more than you should have on 12. Joren didn't flinch anymore when it spoke. He'd trained himself out of that months ago. I noticed. You are starting to forget things you shouldn't forget. His stomach dropped. He hadn't told it. He'd never told it anything, not once. and yet somehow it always seemed to already know exactly what price he'd been quietly paying without a name for it. "What is that?" he said, low, careful. "The forgetting. Is that you?" A silence stretched long enough that he thought it might not answer at all. That had happened before. Questions it simply refused, leaving him with more holes than answers, which had become its own kind of maddening pattern. "It is the price," it said finally. "I did not choose what it costs. I only chose that it would cost something. Then, unchoose it. I cannot. That is not how the bargain was made, or by whom." "Then tell me who made it." Another silence. When it spoke again, its tone had shifted into something almost gentle, almost mournful, the kind of tenderness that felt wildly out of place, from something that had no face and no name he'd ever been given. "Not tonight. Tonight I have only one thing worth saying, and you will not like hearing it." Joren's jaw tightened. "Say it anyway. The count is shorter than they tell you." "The count of what?" He said it out loud, sharper than he meant to, frustration finally cracking through the careful calm he tried to keep whenever it spoke to him. "You give me half of something and then you go quiet. Every time. If you know something is coming, tell me what it is. Tell me how long. Tell me anything I can actually use instead of a sentence I'll spend the next 3 days turning over in my head for nothing. I have told you more tonight than I have told anyone, in longer than you would believe. That's not an answer. It is the only kind of answer I am permitted to give. Even this much costs something I do not enjoy paying." That stopped him. In 11 clears, in every fragment and warning and half-given truth it had handed him, it had never once suggested that speaking costed anything. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption closely, that he was the only one paying for this arrangement. "What does it cost you?" Silence again. Longer this time. Long enough that he thought the conversation had ended the way it usually did, abruptly and without ceremony. Then, faint, almost too quiet to catch. "Something I am running out of faster than you are running out of yours." He waited for more. There wasn't any. The pressure behind his eyes eased, then vanished entirely, leaving him alone in the maintenance scaffolding, with his own heartbeat too loud in his ears, and a sentence he didn't understand, sitting in his chest, like a swallowed stone. "The count of what? Told by who?" He turned the words over a dozen different ways, and none of them settled into something he could act on, which was, he was beginning to realize, exactly how the voice preferred to leave things. Enough truth to be terrifying, never enough to be useful. He thought about Elara instead, because that was where his mind always went when it had nowhere better to land. 5 years ago, almost to the week, he'd been 17. She'd been 21, already bracket 5, already the kind of climber other people pointed at and said someday, and she'd taken him to the concourse the morning of what the Vault Authority now officially logged as the Ashfall Tremor. A minor designation, a footnote in the city's records, 3 lines in an incident report that had never once mentioned her name. He remembered the tremor itself in fragments, the ground moving wrong, sideways instead of down, the sound the tower made, low and endless, like something enormous breathing out. He remembered Elara shoving him toward the evacuation line and telling him to run and not look back, and he remembered not listening, and he remembered the moment he'd turned around anyway, and she was already gone, swallowed by a collapse that the official report called unavoidable structural failure, and that he had never, not once in 5 years, believed was an accident. He remembered her laugh. He remembered the bread stealing. He remembered, with perfect clarity, the exact cadence of her voice saying his name like it was a joke only the two of them understood. He remembered the morning of the tremor itself, in pieces that had never faded, no matter how much else the voice had quietly taken from him since. Elara pulling her climbing gloves on at the kitchen table, telling him between bites of the same bread she'd stolen off his plate that the Vault Authority had posted a floor bulletin overnight, some minor structural notice about vibration readings near the lower brackets. Nothing urgent, nothing anyone official had bothered to explain further. He remembered her saying it like a joke. Probably just settling, she'd said. Old buildings groan. He remembered thinking, at 17, that she was probably right. because she was always right about the tower, because 5 years of climbing it had made her fluent in a language he was still learning to speak. He did not remember the color of her eyes. He sat with that a long time before he made himself get up. Padrick Voss ran a supply shop 3 streets back from the tower's main plaza, a cramped, cluttered space that smelled permanently of gear oil and the particular dust that clung to anything that had spent time near a floor exit. The sign over the door read simply Voss Supply, no flourish, no branding, exactly the way its owner preferred everything about his life to be presented, plainly, and without unnecessary attention. Joren let himself in through the back the way he always did. Padrick didn't look up from the harness he was repairing at his workbench, but the set of his shoulders shifted, an old climber's instinct that registered a familiar footstep before conscious thought caught up. Heard about 12, Padrick said. Word travels. Word travels fast when the number's stupid. Padrick set the harness down and finally turned, and Joren watched the older man's eyes do the same quick practice sweep they always did, checking for injuries first, checking for the specific hollowed-out look that meant something worse than injuries second. Whatever he found in that second pass made his mouth press into a thin line. You're forgetting things again. Joren didn't ask how he knew. Padrick always knew, in the same unspoken way he knew everything about climbing, that he refused to fully explain. A decade and a half of scars and silences that Joren had learned not to push against directly. Small stuff, Joren said. It's fine. It's never small stuff. That's the whole trick of it. Padrick came around the workbench, closing the distance between them with the slight limp he'd carried for as long as Joren had known him, an injury he'd also never explained. You keep telling yourself it's manageable, and one day you look up and it's not small anymore, it's everything, and there's no floor in this tower that gives back what it takes. You don't know what it takes. Nobody does. Not even me. Not really. I know enough. Something moved behind Padrick's eyes then, old and heavy, a weight Joren had glimpsed before and never once been allowed to see the shape of. I know what it looks like when someone decides the climb matters more than what they're carrying up it with them. I've seen it end exactly one way. Is that a warning or a memory? Padrick's hands stilled on the harness entirely. For a moment, the only sound in the shop was the low tick of the heating unit in the corner and the distant hum of the concourse beyond the walls. Joren had asked variations of that question a dozen times over the 2 years he'd known the man, and every time Padrick found a different way to close the door on it without quite lying. Both, Padrick said finally, which was more than he usually gave. 15 years ago, I ran with a team that thought margin was for people who didn't trust their own skill. We were good. Good enough that trusting our skill seemed reasonable. His thumb moved absently over an old scar along his wrist, a habit Joren had seen before, without ever asking about it directly. The tower doesn't care how good you are. It only cares whether you brought enough left over for the moment it decides to test you twice in the same breath. What happened to them? The team. I run a supply shop now instead of climbing. Padrick's voice went flat, the door closing all the way this time, final in a way that made further pushing feel like cruelty rather than curiosity. That's the whole story you're getting tonight. Joren let it go, because Padrick had never once, in 2 years, given him more than that when the door closed like that. The older man turned back to the workbench, picking the harness back up with hands that weren't quite steady. You're going back in tonight, Padrick said, not a question. 13 doesn't stay eligible past midnight. Reset clock. Joren kept his voice level, like it was just logistics, just scheduling, and not the thing that made Padrick's shoulders go rigid all over again. I want to bank the yield before the window closes. You cleared 12 6 hours ago. Your body doesn't reset on the same clock as the eligibility window. I know my limits. You don't. That's exactly the problem. Padrick set the harness down again, harder this time, and turned to face him fully. Listen to me. I've watched climbers who thought they knew their limits get carried out of this tower in pieces. You're not special because the voice talks to you. You're just running out of margin faster than everyone else. And you can't see it because you're the one standing inside it. Joren felt something in his chest go tight and defensive. The old familiar instinct to argue his way past anyone who tried to slow him down. Meera and Talon and now Padrick too. everyone lining up to tell him the same thing in different words. He thought about the sentence still sitting unresolved in his chest. The count is shorter than they tell you. He thought about Elara's eyes, gone. A hole where a memory should be, and felt the fear underneath the defensiveness harden into something closer to certainty. If the count's shorter than everyone thinks, he said quietly, then margin's a luxury I don't have time to build slowly. Padrick's face changed at that, just slightly, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, like Joren had said a sentence close enough to one he'd heard before in a different voice, a long time ago. Whatever it stirred, he didn't share it. Then go, he said instead, rougher than before, turning away again. But you come back through that door tonight. You understand me. Whatever happens in there, you walk back through this door. I always do. You've always been lucky. Padrick didn't look at him when he said it. Luck isn't a plan. Joren left without a better answer, because he didn't have one, and because the eligibility window really was closing, and because some part of him, the part that had been awake since Elara's laugh went quiet 5 years ago, had already decided the answer didn't matter as much as the climb did. The walk back to the Tower Plaza took him past the old lower district, 3 blocks of storefronts and apartment buildings that had never fully recovered from the tremor 5 years back. Scaffolding still braced against 2 of the walls like the city hadn't quite decided whether to finish the repair or admit the buildings were beyond it. Nobody talked about that district much anymore. It had simply become part of the skyline, the way scars became part of a face, something people stopped seeing after enough years of walking past it. He didn't stop seeing it. He never had. A public terminal on the corner cycled through the evening's official notices, cheerful civic blue text scrolling past advertisements for guild recruitment and reminders about tremor drill schedules. And buried near the bottom, easy to miss if he hadn't been half looking for it, a single line about routine seismic monitoring near the tower's lower foundations, readings within expected parameters, no cause for public concern. He read it twice. It was the same phrasing, nearly word for word, as the bulletin Elara had read off a screen just like this one the morning she died. He kept walking. There wasn't anything else to do with that feeling except carry it, the way he carried everything else the tower and the city handed him, and never explained. The plaza was quieter at this hour, most of the daytime crowd gone home, the boards still scrolling their endless column of names and numbers to nobody in particular. He checked the eligibility terminal near the throat's mouth, confirmed floor 13 would drop out of his reach the moment midnight struck, and didn't let himself hesitate long enough to talk himself out of anything. The throat swallowed him again an hour before midnight. Floor 13's seal terminal blinked its ready light as he approached. The 4 tiers laid out in their usual cold rows of text. Standard, elevated, severe, maximum. He didn't hesitate over the selection the way a smart climber would have. He pressed his palm flat against the terminal and chose the 4th option before his own nerves had time to weigh in. The terminal hummed, considering. 13 sat right at the edge of what his bracket allowed him to attempt at max. A hair's difference from 12 in rating, but an entire category heavier in what waited behind the door, and for one suspended second, he thought the system might reject him outright. It didn't. The eligibility line held, because the eligibility line didn't care about wisdom. It only cared about arithmetic, and the arithmetic said yes. Maximum seal confirmed. No retreat until cleared. The door will not open again until you do. The door opened onto darkness that swallowed the concourse light behind him whole, and then it closed, and the sound it made sealing shut was the last ordinary sound Joren heard for a long time. The floor unfolded around him in the particular, dreamlike wrongness every sealed floor carried, space that didn't quite obey the rules of the building it was supposedly inside. A wide stone amphitheater, lit by veins of pale light running through the walls, like something alive. Tiered seating, rising into shadow on every side, as if built for an audience that had left centuries ago and never come back. He'd learned not to waste time being unsettled by the geometry. The geometry wasn't the part that killed you. The warden arrived the way they always did, without warning, without a sound to announce it, simply present where a moment ago there had been only stone. It was easily 3 times his height, built from something that looked like fused black rock and old iron, its surface catching the pale light in a way that made it seem to shift and reform even while standing still. Standard warden encounters had a pattern to them. Predictable openings? Telegraphed strikes? Joren had learned the shapes of a dozen archetypes well enough to read most fights 3 moves ahead by the time he was 2 minutes in. This warden broke pattern in the first 5 seconds. It didn't announce its first strike. It simply crossed the distance between them in a way that shouldn't have been possible for something its size, and Joren's only warning was a change in the pressure of the air, a half breath before the blow landed. He got an arm up. It wasn't enough. The impact threw him across the amphitheater floor hard enough that the world went white at the edges, and he came to a stop against a stone tier, with something in his side screaming in a way that told him a rib had gone. He forced himself upright through sheer refusal, blood in his mouth, vision doubling and resolving and doubling again. Voice, he thought, not a prayer exactly, closer to a demand born from pure animal need. I need you. Nothing answered. The scaffolding conversation had made it clear enough. The voice came when it decided to, not when he called, and standing in the middle of a floor that was actively trying to kill him was apparently not sufficient invitation. The warden came again. This time he was ready enough to move, rolling under the strike instead of blocking it, feeling the wind of its passage rip past close enough to take skin off his shoulder. He got 2 strikes of his own in on the return, both of them landing on plating that didn't so much as crack. This is different, he thought, and the thought arrived with a cold, clear certainty underneath the panic. This isn't fighting like the others fought. This is testing me. The warden paused between attacks in a way none of its predecessors ever had, its featureless, not quite face angled toward him as if it were considering something, weighing him the way a jeweler weighs a stone, before deciding whether it's worth cutting. Then it struck a 3rd time, faster than the first 2 combined, and Joren knew before the blow connected that he wasn't going to get up from it clean. The impact caved something in his chest that made breathing into a wet, ragged effort. He hit the stone tiers again and stayed down this time, vision narrowing to a tunnel, and somewhere very far away he heard himself make a sound he didn't recognize as his own. This is it, he thought, distant and strange, the thought arriving without the terror that should have accompanied it. This is the floor that finally does it, and then, at last, the pressure came behind his eyes. Not now, he thought at it, half fury and half relief. Now would be good. Now would be perfect. Left, it said, a single word, urgent in a way it had never once sounded before. Move left. Now. He didn't question it. He threw everything his broken body had left into rolling left, and the strike that would have ended him instead cratered the stone where he'd been lying a half-second earlier, close enough that debris tore through his jacket and opened a line of fire along his ribs. Rise, the voice said, and this time there was something underneath the word that sounded almost like fear on his behalf. It has learned your pattern. You must break it, or it ends here. How? He gasped, out loud this time, past caring whether it was strange to speak to empty air in the middle of a fight. How do I break a pattern I don't have? Give it a new one. Only once. It will cost. He didn't have time to ask what it would cost before the answer arrived on its own. A flash of understanding dropped directly into his mind, the way nothing had ever come to him before. A single, unfamiliar movement, a way of shifting his weight through his hips instead of his shoulders, that his body had never been trained to make and somehow, impossibly, now knew how to make anyway. He didn't think, he moved. The strike that came next met him in a stance the warden had no record of, no pattern for, and for the first time in the entire fight it hesitated, a fraction of a second of genuine confusion, in something that shouldn't have been able to feel confusion at all. Joren drove through that hesitation with everything his broken body had left, and the blow he landed cracked plating that 3 strikes before had shrugged off everything he'd thrown at it. It wasn't enough to kill. It was enough to stagger. He didn't get another gift from the voice. He didn't need one. He'd felt the new movement once, and something in the pattern of it stayed with him, even as the pressure behind his eyes receded to nothing, gone as quickly as it had come. leaving him alone again with a fight he now, barely, had a chance at winning. The next exchange went to him. He kept the new stance, forced his exhausted body through the unfamiliar hip-driven motion a second time, on nothing but muscle memory that was only minutes old, and opened a second crack running parallel to the first. The warden answered by changing its approach entirely, abandoning the wide, telegraphed strikes for something faster and lower, sweeping at his legs instead of his center of mass, and he barely got clear of it, the edge of the blow numbing his calf enough that he stumbled through his next 2 steps. He hit the ground again on the exchange after that, driven down by a strike he saw coming and simply didn't have the speed left to avoid, and lay there for one long, terrible second, convinced this was finally the one he didn't get up from. Somewhere above him the warden's shadow fell across the pale-lit stone, unhurried, almost patient, as if it had decided the outcome already, and was simply waiting for him to agree with it. He didn't agree with it. He got a hand under himself, then a knee, then drove upward inside the warden's next strike instead of away from it, close enough that the blow meant for his skull only grazed his shoulder, and buried what was left of his blade's edge into the widened crack in its plating. The stone there gave in a way the rest of it never had. He felt it give, felt something underneath finally yield to something outside it, for the first time in the entire fight, and he didn't stop to consider whether that was wisdom or desperation before he drove the blade in again, and a fourth time, until the warden's not-quite face tilted downward toward him with what might, in something that could feel it, have been surprise. It came apart on the 5th strike, dissolving into shards of black stone that scattered and thinned into the pale light bleeding from the walls, leaving nothing behind but silence and the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the particular ringing quiet of an amphitheater built for an audience that never came back to watch him win. He lay on the amphitheater floor for a long time before he found the strength to stand. When the exit door finally recognized his clear and opened, the concourse beyond it was too bright, too loud, the ordinary hum of the city crashing back in all at once after the total silence of the sealed floor. He staggered through the throat on legs that barely held him, one hand pressed hard against ribs that ground wrong with every breath, and he had just enough presence of mind left to register the console reading his tag before the number posted. Floor 13, cleared. Seal tier, maximum. The yield figure that followed made the console's status light flare orange again, harder this time, an entry so far outside the expected range that it required not just verification, but an escalation flag. A little burst of red text underneath the number that Joren was too wrecked to fully parse, before 3 figures stepped out of the shadow of the concourse wall and blocked his path. They wore the dark gray of Vault Authority Enforcement, standard issue, unremarkable except for the fact that there were 3 of them, and they'd clearly been waiting. Joren Talvik, the lead enforcer said, holding up a sealed data slate with a stamped authorization at the top that Joren recognized, even bleeding and half-conscious, as Director Sable Ainsworth's personal signature. By order of the Vault Authority, your climbing license is under immediate review pending suspension. You're going to need to come with us. On what grounds? His voice came out wrecked, barely his own, but the words held together. Endangerment to self and others, pattern violation of eligibility protocols, and failure to report anomalous system interaction. The enforcer recited it the way people recited things they'd memorized, without being told why the words mattered. The director will explain the rest once you're in her office. I haven't broken a single rule. Check the eligibility line yourself. Everything I did tonight was legal. Legal isn't the same as permitted to continue. The second enforcer stepped forward, flanking him, and Joren registered with distant, exhausted clarity that they'd positioned themselves to box him against the throat's wall before he'd even finished speaking. 3 bodies closing a triangle around one climber too broken to run and too stubborn to go quietly. A handful of bystanders near the boards had gone still, watching, the way people watched things they weren't sure they were allowed to watch. Someone near the water station had their comm raised, filming. You're doing this here, Joren said, in front of everyone, right after the clear posts. The timing isn't ours to choose. Something in the lead enforcer's voice shifted, just slightly, Not quite an apology, but close enough to one that Joren filed it away with everything else he was filing away tonight. The order came down within minutes of your entry confirming. That should tell you something about how seriously this is being taken above my rank. Somewhere above the concourse, a siren he'd never heard at that particular pitch before began to climb, rising and rising until it settled into a long, steady wail that every person in the plaza seemed to recognize a half second before he did. The alert tone for an ashfall tremor rated severe, the first time that word had been broadcast over the city in 5 years. Not since the week Elara died. The concourse changed shape around the sound. Climbers who'd been watching the enforcers with quiet, wary curiosity a moment ago were already moving, some toward the nearest evacuation stair, some simply frozen the way people froze when a warning arrived, too large to process at street level. A voice came over the public address a beat behind the siren, flat and official in a way that did nothing to soften what it said. Severe ashfall tremor detected. All non-essential personnel proceed to designated shelter points immediately. This is not a drill. Even the lead enforcer's composure slipped, his eyes flicking upward toward the boards as if the ranking displays might somehow explain a reading like that. They didn't. The boards kept scrolling yield totals and climber names, oblivious, while overhead the siren kept climbing through registers Joren had only ever heard once before in his life, on a morning that had ended with his sister's name reduced to 3 lines in an incident report. Joren's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall of the throat, blood in his mouth, ribs screaming, the enforcer's data slate still hanging in the air between them unresolved. And in the middle of all of it, quiet and sudden and impossible, the pressure came behind his eyes one more time. The voice had never said a name before, not once, in 11 clears, in 100 fragments of cryptic warning and half-given truth. It said one now, so softly he almost missed it under the siren. Elara. Smash that like button if this cliffhanger got you.